the last kind of element, again, that people aren't really talking about, right? There's the reconstruction of Europe. There's a reconstruction of Ukraine. People aren't talking about that. The other thing people aren't talking about is NATO's role in the reconstruction of Ukraine and NATO's role in the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine and Russia, like you and I discussed, that is actually a conflict in Europe. We shouldn't talk about it just as Ukraine-Russia. We should talk about it as the European conflict. When you look at it as a European conflict, it's really interesting because NATO, and specifically the European countries in NATO, take America out, take Canada out, the European countries in NATO are very much divided on what to do in Ukraine. Germany didn't want to send them weapons. They only caved under intense pressure from the United States, right? The French president has been outspoken from the very beginning that he didn't want to stir up or anger and incite additional Russian aggression. He was the one that made Biden stop talking such fervent. I mean, if you recall, Biden made a speech in Poland where he called for the unseating of Putin, right? He called for regime change in Poland until President Macron came in and said, we don't talk about that, right? You're not welcome to speak that way in NATO territory, right? So the French president, the German chancellor, even Hungary as a country as a whole has taken a very strong stance against American direction of NATO. So if we were to take America out of NATO right now, support for Ukraine would dry up. Mm-hmm. The NATO countries, the European countries themselves, they don't want this conflict. They've really only acquiesced to intense American pressure for this conflict. And because America has put so much money into the conflict itself, when the conflict is over, America's not going to want to put in the money for humanitarian aid. America's going to want to get its payback. It's going to want to be paid back for reconstruction efforts, but it's going to force the NATO partners to take care of all the humanitarian aid, right? So it's this situation where Europe can see the writing on the wall. Europe's in a hurt locker. They have to do what America tells them to do right now because America is like the only superpower on their side. Mm-hmm. China wants to woo Europe, but Europe doesn't trust China. And Russia's right on the doorstep of Europe, so they don't want to trust Russia. So they're left with only one ally, and it's us, and we're bullies too. So Europe doesn't really know what to do. They don't want this conflict. They've paid the price. Absolutely, there was an energy crisis all winter. Mm-hmm. It was not as drastic as some of us were expecting it to be because winter was warm, but they were still paying 400 times the price or 400% more for energy than what they were paying before. Businesses still shut down. Governments had to subsidize individual people to be able to pay their heating bills and their gas bills over the winter, right? And it's not over yet. It's only March. Uh-huh. So there's still cold weather in Europe. So it's just Europe and the United States are not nearly as aligned as American headlines want you to believe. And all you have to do to see that is read European headlines, right? Read a newspaper from the UK. Read a periodical that comes out of Europe. Just put away CNN, definitely put away CNN. Put away all of your liberal news sources that are based in the United States. And you can still read liberal news sources in Europe and you'll get a more accurate representation of the fact that Europe is not nearly as aligned as our newspapers try to make us think they are. And they're worried. They're worried that they're going to get called in to spend a bunch of their money to help rebuild a Ukraine that never benefited them.
Interesting. Last night at dinner, you brought up a very good point on how we are shipping all of our old military equipment into Ukraine. And it's an aspect that it just had not crossed my mind. Can you go into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so wars are fought first through supply chains, right? And during peacetime, the United States military has certain requirements to maintain a peacetime arsenal and peacetime level production. So peacetime production and peacetime supply reserves are much less than wartime, right? And it's because the idea is if some kind of conflict were to break out, then all of the existing supply would be used to support the conflict while we spun up production to start producing more weapons. Well, what happened here is that the conflict wasn't with the United States. The conflict was with not even an American ally, but a country that we chose to support at a certain time. So all of our reserves of weapons, which were all dated, they all had a shelf life, right? It's kind of like when you fill your pantry with canned tuna fish and canned beans. As soon as a snowstorm hits, you use that first because you want to use it up, right? You don't want it to expire. So we sent them all of these dated weapons. That was the first round of weapons that we sent. Well, then, as the conflict continued, we started seeing it as an opportunity for us to test some of our more modern weapons. So we sent HIMARS. Now we're sending different types of satellites and radio equipment, right? We started sending more experimental stuff, drones, to Ukraine. But we never started resupplying our stocks because we kept producing at peacetime levels, even though Ukraine is spending ammunition at wartime levels. So that was part of the reason the United States started telling Germany and France and Poland they had to start sending weapons to Ukraine, was because our peacetime reserves were used up and our peacetime production levels can't maintain the fight. Mm-hmm. So we're in this jam. And in this jam, we have to decide as a country, do we start producing at wartime levels, even though we're not at war? One of the big reasons that you see bipartisan support for the conflict in Ukraine is because both Republicans and Democrats know that their constituencies are going to benefit when the American military-industrial machine starts producing at wartime levels, producing more ammunition, more cannons, more small arms, more protective gear. We're going to make a huge stockpile to support us if we ever go to war with China, but we're also going to create this huge stockpile that we can then keep using to supply Ukraine and drive up GDP, drive up American benefits, right? The same thing is happening in Russia. And this is where, again, if you're going to be honest, you gotta call honesty for what it is. Russia is fighting Ukraine with Russia's old weapons. That's why the tanks that they use and the guns that they use and the ammunition that they use failed them. We sent our surplus and our stockpile to support Ukraine. Russia used their surplus and their stockpile to launch an invasion. That's why it didn't work. Now, all of Russia's best stuff, Russia's a little bit like us. They create weapons. They invent weapons. They also manufacture weapons, but the main source of their income is in exporting those weapons. If you like this short clip, make sure you click here to see the next clip or here to see the full podcast episode.
So fresh, so new.